Hello, friends. Welcome to the Fresh Trails. Today, our subject is international politics, specifically about international organizations, their concepts and origins. Why is it important to know this history? Come with us to find out.
Okay, so let's set the scene. To really grasp why countries ever decided to team up in the first place, you kind of have to imagine the First World War as this massive, devastating superstorm that just rips straight through our global neighborhood. I mean, when the winds finally died down around 1918, the whole community was literally in ruins. Millions of lives were gone, entire empires had completely collapsed. And standing there in the wreckage, the surviving neighbors looked around and realized a pretty terrifying truth. They desperately needed a permanent system to stop this kind of absolute destruction from ever happening again.
You see, before this great storm, the neighborhood just relied on what we call international institutions. Now, think of these as informal habits, unwritten rules, or just simple handshake agreements, like, promising your neighbor you won't throw trash over their fence. But the war proved that handshakes, they just aren't enough when things get ugly. The world realized it needed an international organization. And by that, I mean a formal, physical entity, like a local village council that has an actual physical office, a dedicated staff working every day, and clearly written rules that everyone actually agrees to follow.
So this burning desire to get a formal governing body up and running is what gave birth to the League of Nations, which officially kicked off in 1920. It was a really big deal, the world's very first permanent intergovernmental organization totally dedicated to keeping universal peace, and the main guy driving this was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. He championed this really beautiful concept called collective security. The idea was super simple but really powerful. If one neighbor's house is being broken into by a burglar, the entire neighborhood rushes out to protect them. The security of one person literally becomes the security of everyone.
But here's where the story takes a wild twist. Right as this brand new global village council was being set up, its main architect faced a massive rebellion in his own home. President Wilson's own household, the U.S. Congress, flat out refused to approve the treaty. They essentially locked him out of the very association he just helped build. So right out of the gate, the League of Nations launched with this massive handicap, totally missing one of the wealthiest, most powerful founders of the global neighborhood.
Even with the U.S. missing, though, they pushed forward and set up their new government exactly like a local homeowners association. First up, you had the Assembly. Think of this as the big town hall meeting where every single neighbor state gathered once a year, and everyone, big or small, got an equal vote. Then you had the Council, which was a smaller, exclusive executive board of the major powers, meant to handle any urgent, late-night crises. And finally, the Secretariat. These were essentially the property managers based in Geneva, Switzerland, handling all the day-to-day administrative chores and endless paperwork. On paper, this structure sounds pretty solid, right? Well, they actually wrote a critical, fatal flaw straight into their bylaws. They required 100% unanimous consent for any major decision. Think about that for a second. If you live in a village with 50 different families, what are the odds every single one of them agrees on what color to paint the community center? This golden rule of unanimity basically meant that any single neighbor on the board had the power to veto and completely block any action. It was literally a recipe for total paralysis. Now, you might be thinking this whole thing was a disaster from day one. But actually, no. In those early days, they got some real community work done. Surprisingly, during the 1920s, a genuine spirit of communal unity really took hold. The trauma of the war was still fresh, so everyone was eager to pitch in and help out. During this sort of honeymoon phase, the League successfully stepped in as a neutral mediator to settle boundary disputes between neighbors without a single punch being thrown. For instance, they calmed down a really tense disagreement between Sweden and Finland, and they diffused a nasty border clash between Greece and Bulgaria. When the issues were relatively small and people were willing to talk, the system actually functioned exactly like it was supposed to.
And it went way beyond just breaking up fights. The council organized this incredible community aid that changed everyday lives. They created the Nansen Passport, which gave hundreds of thousands of displaced refugees a legal identity so they could finally find new homes. They also did the heavy lifting to standardize vaccines across the globe for terrible diseases like diphtheria and tetanus. Plus, they started pushing hard for safer labor standards for workers everywhere. This kind of everyday technical cooperation, it was a massive, undeniable success.
But as we rolled into the 1930s, those sunny days completely vanished. A massive economic depression slammed into the global neighborhood. Suddenly, jobs vanished, money dried up, and people grew incredibly desperate. And we all know what happens when financial panic sets in, right? That cooperative spirit evaporates fast. It was quickly replaced by this aggressive, selfish nationalism. Neighbors stopped looking out for each other and literally started boarding up their own windows, eyeing everyone else with deep suspicion.
But you know how it is? Eventually, every neighborhood has to deal with the bully. And this was the League's ultimate test.
In that toxic environment of fear and poverty, a few aggressive households decided they were just going to solve their economic problems by taking over other people's yards by brute force, and the dominoes started to fall. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. A few years later, Italy brutally attacked Ethiopia. The smaller, victimized neighbors ran straight to the League of Nations, crying out for that collective security they were promised. But remember that paralyzing rule of 100% agreement? Because the aggressors were sitting right there on the council, and the other major powers were too broke or scared to fight back, the League froze. They debated, they sent committees, but they totally failed to protect the victims.
And instead of facing any actual biting consequences, like strict economic sanctions or the neighborhood police showing up, the aggressive nations found a massive loophole. When the League politely asked them to stop, Japan, Italy, and eventually Germany simply canceled their memberships. They literally just tore up their community association cards and walked away from the council. Just like that, they were free to continue their violent expansions without any legal oversight from the League at all.
The fallout from this was a steep, fatal collapse. When the smaller, more vulnerable neighbors realized the association was completely toothless, that the guards basically had no weapons to protect them from the bullies, they lost all faith. They abandoned the League in absolute droves as the 1930s drew to a close.
So let's step back for a second. Why exactly did this grand experiment fall apart so badly?
Ultimately, the League failed because it relied 100% on the honor system. It completely lacked the physical enforcement mechanisms needed to actually stop an aggressor. And this total paralysis sent a loud and clear message to the bullies of the world. You can do whatever you want, and absolutely no one is going to stop you. The failure of the League directly paved the way for the most devastating brawl in human history, the Second World War. The exact nightmare the League was created to prevent happened again, and this time it was far, far worse.
Now, it's really easy to just look at the League as a total failure. But honestly, that's not the whole story. They left us an incredible foundation.
Because humanity is resilient, right? The global community learned a hard, painful lesson. They realized the core idea of an international village council wasn't wrong. The execution was just totally flawed. So they took the blueprint of the League, brushed off the ashes, and used it to build the United Nations. And the most crucial upgrade they made, they threw out that paralyzing rule of total unanimity. Instead, they created a UN Security Council with a much more realistic voting structure. They concentrated the power of enforcement among the major players and actually gave them the legal and military tools to take decisive action against anyone threatening world peace.
And we absolutely have to remember that the League's quiet, behind-the-scenes community work survived the war. Those incredible health programs they started, they evolved directly into the World Health Organization. Their pioneering refugee work became the UNHRC. Even the International Labor Organization, which was born right alongside the League, continues to protect workers' rights to this very day. So while the League may have failed politically, its humanitarian DNA lives on everywhere in our modern world.
So tracing this whole journey, it's a pretty dramatic path. We start in the absolute devastation of 1918, move to the hopeful, maybe slightly naive, creation of the League in 1920. Then we ride through those brutal economic crises and unchecked invasions of the 1930s, which led straight to the League's collapse and the tragedy of 1939. And finally, having learned those harsh lessons, we witnessed the birth of a much stronger, more resilient United Nations in 1946.
Without the experience of the League of Nations, the UN would probably not exist. And what about you? Did you know that a failed union of countries gave rise to our United Nations? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and send this video to anyone who might need it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.